This is my first time ever trying to record a 30-minute actual tutorial, so you guys will have to bear with me because I'm not going to do the normal editing I do when I trip over my words. So now you get to see what a fool I actually am. I have started out this project by first very lightly drawing out the eye. That portion I did before I started recording just because I have to do so much erasing and readjusting everything. So now that everything's very lightly drawn out, I am using a mechanical pencil that is filled with AN4B lead, which is really a very soft lead, so it gets super dark. I'm going through and drawing out the areas that I know are going to be pretty well defined. Whenever I work in graphite, or really anything in black and white, I like to lay down my darkest colors first, or my darkest values first, so that it makes it easier for me to judge the rest of the values. So again, first I'm just loosely sketching out or darkening up the previous lines that I've already sketched out. And apparently that was supposed to be an eyelash and I went too dark. Now you're going to see me throughout this tutorial. I'm using my hand and my finger to get rid of eraser marks quite a bit. Don't do that. That is a horrible habit and not something that I normally do when I'm working on a real project. You want to use a brush of some sort to get rid of any eraser marks so that you don't get the oils from your skin on the paper, first of all. But mainly you end up smudging your paper if you're using your hand, or your pencil you'll smudge if you use your hand to brush away any loose pencil marks or erasers. As I block in where the eyebrows are going to go, notice that I'm keeping these marks very loose. You don't want any of these to be perfectly straight. They're all slightly curved. I start out by pushing a little bit harder with the pencil, and I lift up on the pressure as I get to the end of each hair. That way it starts out thicker and ends out thinner towards the end, so it looks more like a real hair. As I move on to outlining the area where the shine is going to be on the eye, I'm lining that so that I know to keep those areas white, because if I do shade them too dark to start with, no matter how much I erase, I'm never going to get the paper white again, and that is one of few areas on a drawing that you do want, or on a portrait that you are going to want to stay very white. As I work on the pupil, notice that I am doing little circles. I'm overlapping these circles over each other so that I don't have heavy pencil lines anywhere. You don't want to randomly start scribbling in every direction, or you end up being able to see those lines. Unless your goal is to have a cross-hatched look, you want to do these little circles and let them overlap so that you get that nice soft finish. As always, I'm starting off by putting in my darkest values first, just on the very darkest areas, so that it's easier when I do all of the areas like the white of the eye. It makes it much easier for me to judge how light or dark my values need to be, because I'm not just fighting the white of the paper. I'm softening the edge of the pupil into the iris, and then I'm going to go around the iris and darken everything up along that edge. Now the majority of people are going to have this darker rim around their eye, especially if they have lighter colored eyes, but not everybody. So definitely pay attention to your reference photos. If you're doing a portrait, that sort of detail is going to make a big difference in making that person look like the person it's supposed to look like. I'm now using a shading tool, and this shading tool is actually really dirty. It already has tons of graphite on it from previous uses. So I'm using that to lightly shade in everywhere that the iris is. Now you don't have to use a shading tool. If you prefer to just use pencil with a light hand, you can definitely do that. If I were to use pencil, at this point I would probably be using a 5H and just doing several layers until I got it to the value that I wanted. The 5H would be a harder lead, and so you're going to get softer lines. Now I'm darkening up that edge one more time. I'm also going to fix the shape of the eye here where it wasn't rounded off quite enough. Now the angle that the camera is, it does give the illusion that the eye is definitely not rounded. It's a lot closer than it looks like at this angle. Now I'm just paying close attention to my reference photo and looking at areas that need to be darker. Now when you do eyes on people, they will almost always have a shadow underneath that upper eyelid. If you forget to put that shadow and you have the same value all the way around the eye, it looks like their eyes are bugging out of their head, like they've been given some kind of medication that has them wired, or way too much coffee, that sort of thing. You want to get that shadow underneath that upper eyelid. The exception to that is going to be if you have really unusual lighting, but that is pretty uncommon. Normally you're going to have this shadow. I'm still working in teeny tiny little circles to keep my lines very soft. You hear me talk a lot in colored pencil about not starting off by pushing too hard on the paper because you flatten out the paper. And if you damage the paper by flattening it out like that, it's not going to take as many layers of the graphite. So just like with colored pencil, you want to keep a very light hand to start off with and build up your values by layering. The reflections on somebody's eye, depending on their surroundings, will also make a difference on what lines go where and how much you can see of lights and darks. So again, just like before, pay attention to your reference photo. Every time you see me pause and remove my hand from the paper, I'm usually glancing right back up at my reference photo to double check my work against what it is that I'm copying. Now, honestly, if you're just doing a random eye, that's not a big deal, but you don't have to have it exact. But when you're learning how to draw eyes, I do recommend have a reference or a good reference photo or a model, something that you can refer to so that you get good at drawing eyes accurately. There's just a lot more detail in the eye than most people realize, and so if you've not done it by copying it correctly over and over again, when you go to freehand it on your own without that reference, you won't know what to put where. Now I'm highlighting the bottom portion of the eye that is opposite of where the shine in the eye is. The reason for this is that's basically where the light is escaping. You have the light hitting where the shine of the eye is, and it escapes on the opposite end. So you're usually going to have the bottom section of the eye highlighted a bit. Again, using my hand to wipe away eraser marks, don't do that. Now here I'm rounding off the eye and working on that pink section on the inner corner. This is a really important thing that you don't want to miss when you're doing portraits. The white of the eye does not go from corner to corner. You have this white fleshy area that has a technical name that I cannot think of right now, but you have this corner that has the pink, and you want to make sure that that is in there and that that has the detail. Otherwise the eye will look very, very flat and cartoony. Shading the upper lid now. Now notice when I'm doing a lot of short sketchy marks, watch out for doing that too much. I'm overlapping my lines on top of each other so I don't get a fluffy look. But one thing that I see a lot of students do, they'll keep making these short little marks over and over again, and they end up making everything look fluffy. If you want things to look smooth and you don't want a fuzzy look, try to keep your lines long, smoother strokes versus those short little ones like what I was doing. I'm using the shading tool again to darken up the upper eyelid. Now, if I were working on an actual portrait, I would have some tracing paper or something under my hand so that the oils of my hands wouldn't be getting on the paper. The oils of your hands can damage the paper, making it less archival. I'm doing little half circles, or, well, half circles and full circles to shade in the area between the eye and the eyebrow. I'm also going to want to pull a lot of that shading into the eyebrow itself, because not only do I have dark hairs in that eyebrow, but I need to be able to come back through with the eraser to lift some lighter areas in. You don't want, in most cases anyway, you're not going to want every single line or hair in this case to be exactly the same value. And an easy way to get variance in there is to use the eraser for part of it. Part with the pencil, part with the eraser. Now again, if you don't like using the shading tool, if you're not comfortable with that, you can do all of this with pencil alone with shading. You just have to be really careful, and it is a bit more time consuming. I personally really enjoy shading with the shading tool or with blending cloths. It gives you a really nice soft look. The other thing that I really like about using these tools for shading is that you use the eraser to pull out highlights again. The eraser will pretty much erase every single thing that you've shaded with the blending tool or a blending cloth, because you've not really ground the graphite into the paper. So when you're doing highlights and such, it's really nice if this is the way that you've gotten your dark areas first. I'm not sure if that made any sense. So now I'm using the blending cloth to really soften this area out. Now my blending cloth is the same as my shading tool, where it's fairly dirty, so parts of it are going to have so much graphite on it, I don't even have to reload or have graphite on the paper to get graphite to come off the cloth onto the paper. I can actually do the shading with the cloth all in its own. I'm using the tip of my shading stump, blending tool, whatever you want to call it. I'm using the tip of that to get some of the softer detail around the edge of the eye. I used a Tombow mono eraser to erase that inner line for the tear line. Now this is really important. One of the things that a lot of artists will do when they draw eyes is they completely miss that tear line, and that's a huge, huge deal. It makes the eye look very cartoony. You want to see almost everybody you're going to see that tear line on. Now for the eyelashes, notice that they're being drawn in clumps. Now this is a man, and so he doesn't have his eyelashes curled or wearing mascara, so his eyelashes are not all angled upwards. You can see here they're starting to go down into part of the eye, and that's actually what's partially covering some of that highlight, are the eyelashes and the reflection from the eyelashes. But when you draw them, they fan out. They don't just go straight in any one direction. These are all slightly curved, and you'll notice that I'll have a lot of them where there's two that start separate but end clumped together, so they form almost a little bit of a curved triangle. Shading in part of the white of the eye with the blending cloth there. I just want that to be really, really soft. Even the whites of the eye are very rarely going to have any actual white showing. Adding a little bit of detail for the veining in the eye, but for this one I don't want that to be too severe, so I'm going really soft. Back down, defining the separation between the actual eye and where the waterline is on the inner portion. I don't want this line to be heavy. You want to be able to see that it's there. You want to be able to see separation between the white of the eye and the tear line, but you don't want it to look like there's eyeliner on that inner line there. Now the bottom lashes are almost always going to be much, much lighter in value than the upper lashes, so keep that in mind as you draw those in. And this is the same thing, they kind of fan out. You don't want them all going the same direction. Pay attention to your reference photo as you're learning how to do this. The eyelashes start from the outer edge of that tear line, not from the intersection that's touching the eyeball. That's really, really important. Adding a bit more detail here to the iris and getting some more of the shadows in. Now part of this that I'm working on now, the upper section is actually touching the eyelashes, and then it just kind of fades out into the irises. I'm using a pencil. This one is likely a 9B or an 8B, something like that. It's a softer lead, so I'm getting darker lines now for these eyelashes. I've switched to this instead of just using my mechanical pencil for all of it because I want some of these lines to be a little bit thicker. The mechanical pencil gets really, really fine lines, and here I want it to be fairly soft. I don't want you to see every single individual eyelash because that usually looks pretty weird. Just think when you look at somebody, you're not seeing each individual hair. You're seeing everything more clumped together. And so here, it's more about the shadows of where they go. So that's why I switched to an actual pencil with a slightly more dull tip than using the mechanical pencil. Pulling out a few of the darker eyelashes now. Now notice how light, if you look back where I started, those eyelashes were super, super light, and I've just slowly been going back through and lightening them up. And it's always better to go too light than too dark because it's really easy to darken something back up, but not the opposite. I'm also using that Tombow Mono Eraser to pull out some highlights on the eyelashes too, just to get some different colors in there. I say highlights, but that's not actually what I mean. I want actual lighter hairs in a few of the, mixed in with some of the darker ones. Using the mechanical pencil now with the AN4B lead to better define a few of these eyelashes. Again, you don't want to go too crazy with it. Now notice how those fan out. They're not all going the same direction. I can't stress that enough. Back to that inner corner of the eye. This has a lot of detail. So if you're doing something like this where you're close up to the eye, you're going to put in all of that detail. If it's something where it's a full portrait and it's not quite so enlarged, you won't see this much detail in that corner. Just make sure that you've got the hint in that case. Like if you're doing an oil painting of the full face, make sure you've got a hint of that darker inner corner. But here I've got a little bit more detail where I'm putting some highlights and shadows. I like to keep a couple of different blending tools or blending stumps. The one that I had just used is very clean, and I use that for areas that I don't want to get too dark, but I do want to smudge out some of the pencil lines that I put on there. The other ones that you've seen me use up to this point were already really, really dark and had tons of graphite on them. So by keeping one clean and one that's got tons of graphite on it, it lets me use it for both light areas and dark areas. And just a good habit to get into, having one that's saved for clean or lighter areas and one for darker. I'm probably sharpening pencils at this point. Or more likely I had dropped that blending stump on the floor and was trying to find it. So I'm softening out that upper lid, or not upper lid, but the white on the eye. I don't want a heavy, harsh line anywhere. I just want this to be softly fading from the dark of the upper lid, which is what's causing the shadow there, down to the lighter area. Again, this helps to keep the eye from looking like it's staring at you all crazy. You also want to pay attention to the fact that you're on your portrait. Notice whether or not that iris touches the bottom lid or not. A lot of people, the iris almost never touches the bottom lid, but more often than not, you're going to have the iris touch both upper and bottom lids. So pay attention to that when you do your portrait, because not only does it change the expression of the person, it can actually change the whole look of the person. I have a cousin whose lower lid, or the lower portion of the white, always shows. His upper, or the iris never touches the lower lid. And so if someone were to paint him and they painted the iris all the way down touching that lower lid, it wouldn't look like him. So that is just something you really want to watch for. Here I'm just going through and darkening up certain areas around the face. And when I work, I like to move back and forth, darkening up areas, lightening areas back up. That's just how I work. If you work to where you work on one teeny tiny area until it's finished, that's okay too. It really is just whichever way works better for you. I'm using the shading tool to darken up part of the eyebrow again. Now the shading tool or the blending stump can give you a bit more control over where you're putting the light and the dark areas. You can actually draw with this. But if you're having a hard time and you're getting harsh lines from that shading tool where you don't want them, you can switch to your some sort of blending cloth, which will give you a nice soft finish. Darkening up under the tear line, which will make that tear line pop out just a bit more. And again over the shadow on the eyelid. Now it's important here where I've got the crease in the eye. Notice that I don't have it completely white up against the lower lid where that shadow is, because this is a man and he's not wearing eyeshadow. I want to make sure that that is a soft shadow. If this was a woman wearing eyeshadow, then that may be a harsher line there. But here I actually want that line to slightly fade both up above it and below it. here, just the tips of the eyelashes where it curved down, covering portions of the iris, and then back up over the eyelid is what I was working on there. Darkening up that outer edge where the actual eyelashes are coming or attaching to that lower lid. And really from here on out, I am just working on teeny tiny details. There's nothing exciting. It's not some big change from this point. It's just all of these little details that you continue to work on will build up into making the eye look more realistic. And now that everything's pretty well blocked in, it makes it a lot easier for me to judge my values so that I can tell where I need to go lighter or darker. Now I'm back up to the eyebrows and I am better defining those hairs. I'm paying close attention to the direction of them, and a lot of these eyebrow hairs need to be able to overlap and cross each other, so pay attention to that for getting a realistic look. They don't all just go in the same direction. You don't want this to look too uniformed. And again, once you have, I've talked about this before, once you've done enough portraits, or let's say it's flowers that you're working on, once you've completed enough of a certain object, you are not going to need to pay such close attention to your reference photo because you have a general idea of how hairs should line up and how they should overlap, or if you're doing a petal, how petals would overlap, that sort of thing. And you'll get to where you pretty much have memorized how a lot of this will lay. But when you're first learning how to draw certain things, it's so important that you've got a really good reference photo, and that you keep looking at the reference photo. That's one thing that I see a lot of my teenager students especially do. They'll be working from a reference photo, but they never look at it. They'll just keep looking at their own piece. You have to get yourself trained so that you're constantly looking up at that reference photo and just memorizing what everything looks like, where everything goes. And not just where things go, but the value of things too, the color of things. If it's a harsh line or a soft line, all of these things are things you need to be paying attention to when you look at your reference photos. Now most of these hairs you'll notice that I'm starting from the base of the hair and working out to the end, which thins it out. While I want that tear line to show, I also don't want it to be solid white or to be the lightest portion of the drawing. So that's why I've gone back through with the shading tool and darken that up. I will come back through with an eraser and pull out a few highlights just in the center of that. But because I did the shading tool with the blending tool, no, that didn't come out right. Because I did this shading there with the blending tool, the eraser is going to be able to pull everything back up to complete white if I want it. Most of the time when you're seeing me switch to one of these turquoise pencils by Prismacolor, which aren't my favorite, but they're only I can't talk. They're the only ones that I have in that grade of pencil at this point, but I should really invest in some Derwent ones. I'm much happier with them. Anyway, every time you see me switch to that Prismacolor turquoise on this piece, I'm usually going to a 4 or a 5H. If I'm using a black pencil, those are my Derwents, and I'm usually using a 7, 8, or 9B. And then again, in the mechanical pencil, that's always going to be the A and 4B lead, and that will get darker than any of the other leads. Even though it's 4B, so it should technically be lighter than the 9B in the regular graphite pencil, that A and 4B is just so soft, it gets things really, really dark. Now, if you use a light enough hand and you're using the shading tool, you don't need to have the full set of every value of graphite there is. You can get away with doing almost everything you need with the darkest pencils. For years, the only thing I worked in was the Prismacolor Ebony. The equivalent to that, which I actually like a lot better, is the General's Layout Extra Black. It gets a little bit darker than the Prismacolor Ebony, but both will work for you. For years, that was the only pencil that I used, and I controlled how light or dark it was based on how much pressure I was applying to the pencil, and by using my shading tools. You can also use paper towels or tissues as long as there's no aloe or anything like that in them, or cotton balls and Q-tips to blend too, if that works better for you, or if you don't have shading tools available. The shading tools are pretty inexpensive. One thing I do want to say, a lot of people will sand these down or sort of sharpen them as they get dull with time. That gives it a really weird texture, and sometimes that will come out in your actual drawing. So I don't recommend doing that. To keep everything nice and soft, I just get a new blending stump if I need it, but most of the blending stumps you see me use, I've had for 5 or 6 years, and knowing you guys know how much I paint and draw, they really don't need to be replaced that often. I just keep one that is, or two, that is really dirty, like the one that I'm using right now, and then I keep the separate ones that are clean for the lighter areas. But you don't need to sharpen or sand these down. Now, one of the benefits of going over some of those hairs that I've done in the eyebrow with the shading tool is that I'm smudging them a little bit so that they're not quite as harsh. It gives it a more realistic look when it has that softer tone to it. Some of these I will want more defined, but definitely not all of them. Hey, look, I finally used a brush to wipe away my eraser marks. Okay, if I had that available, why was I using my hand earlier? Softening that outer rim on the iris, because while I do want it darker, I don't want that to be a harsh line. So just using the blending stump back and forth over this will soften it out. And then this is the portion of the drawing where I am just doing all of those final little details. Actually, I've been at that point for a while, but nothing is major, but it all adds up, so it's all worth it in the end. Now you can see I'm using the eraser to pull out some highlights on that tear line, which pull out really, really easily because of having shaded it with the blending tool. Lost my train of thought there. Doing small studies like this, if you are really interested in doing portraits, I strongly recommend these smaller studies. Do just a nose, or just a mouth, just an eye, just an earlobe, just something small like that. Get to where you're really comfortable doing those smaller sections before you try doing the full portrait. That way it's not quite as overwhelming, and when you do move on to doing the full portrait, you know really well how everything's constructed. So it makes it much easier than if you start off by trying to put everything together at once. Now I'm shading with the edge of the tool, or the pencil here, to keep it really, really soft. I want this area to be darker, and the shading tool is not going to get it dark enough on its own, but I don't want those to have any sharp lines, so that's why I used the edge of the pencil there to shade those in. And then I went too dark, so I'm going to have to come back through on part of this with the eraser. I'm using the eraser very, very softly so I don't end up with harsh lines like that. That was a mess up. Make sure to watch when you do use an eraser over a light area that the edge of the eraser is clean. I use my jeans and just rub the eraser back and forth on it, and that will clean it up so you don't end up with accidental smudges where you were trying to remove another area. When you get to this stage of painting or drawing, this is the point where you want to start backing away more often and looking at it from a distance, so it makes it easier to see what you may want to change. Sometimes it's just as simple as something needing to be a little bit darker or a little bit lighter, but it's hard to see when you're up this close to it. Plus, it's good to give your eyes that break anyway. That Tombow Mono Eraser has a really small point. I love it. I used to use my electrical eraser quite a bit, but I've gotten to where I actually prefer that Tombow Mono Eraser. I don't even know where my electrical eraser is right now. Or electric eraser. I'm adding extra syllables in there. But I haven't used it in so long, and I haven't needed it because of that Tombow Mono Eraser. They're still handy to have. I just don't find myself needing it so much now. I was using a kneaded eraser there. Those are nice because you can adjust the shape of them and you can just dab it onto the paper to pull off some of the graphite, which is really handy depending on the look you're trying to get. Like here, I want a more mottled look, so I'm just dabbing the eraser over part of that area. And that is pretty much it. Thanks for hanging in with me on my first time doing a live or real-time tutorial. That was a little bit painful for me, so I hope it wasn't too bad for you guys. That's pretty much it. If you have any questions, definitely let me know.